What's up, all you cool cats and kittens? Dr. Scott here again with another episode of my coronavirus series. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about viral transmission. So, how does a virus get from the cells in your body out into the environment to infect other people? Before we get into that, though, let's do a little bit of review from last time. So, last time we talked about just basics of cell biology. Here's a eukaryotic cell, are the cells that make you up. And that eukaryotic cell has a nucleus with the genetic information, the DNA that makes you you. And we also talked about the central dogma of molecular biology, which is this DNA is transcribed into RNA, which is then translated into what we call protein, which again is what makes up most of your body. Now what the virus does is the virus is going to come and he's going to settle down on what we call a receptor. So remember, think of the cell as like the Death Star. There are all kinds of points of entry, but in order to get in, you have to have the right identification. So it just so happens that the receptor that COVID-19 binds specifically, we have already identified. And that receptor is what we call ACE2. So what it does is the coronavirus settles on this receptor and the cell sees it and its identification, and it's like, all right, hey, he's cool, let him in. So then the virus comes into the cell. Oops, that's kind of a big smear for a virus. The virus gets into the cell and then hijacks the machinery that go through this natural process. So instead of making what it's supposed to make, the cell then makes what we call more virus particles, so more of the virus. And as I said last time, this virus can cause this one cell to make millions of virus particles before that cell dies. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is happening here specifically. So COVID-19 is what we call a zoonotic virus. And what that means is it's a virus that crosses over from animals. Now, this is not super common. In fact, most animal viruses do not have the proper identification to get into cells. So generally, if we're exposed to an animal virus, it kind of hangs out and then it dies because it doesn't have any way into our cells. COVID-19, on the other hand, just by chance, has developed this identification system that binds to these ACE2 receptors to let it in. Now, the reason that being a zoonotic virus is important is because this is why we see such a variation in symptoms and intensities for different people that catch this virus. So in human history, we have grown up alongside of different coronaviruses that are human-specific, rhinoviruses, another virus that causes the common cold, and the flu virus. So we're used to these viruses, and that's why they're pretty predictable on how they behave, how long they stay in our body, who is at danger, who's not. But with these animal viruses, when they cross over, our bodies aren't used to them, and they're not used to us. So they can cause this array of different symptoms that are really unpredictable. So generally speaking, it's not in a virus's best interest to kill the host because the goal of a virus is to infect and then spread so that it can keep multiplying. But with coronavirus, we see that it does actually have a significant death rate, and that's because it can initiate things like cytokine storm because our body sees it and it flips out because it doesn't know what it is. And in doing so, by creating the cytokine storm to try and destroy the virus, it can actually destroy our bodies as well. Another complicating factor is, generally, coronavirus likes to infect the epithelial lining of our respiratory tract. And that's because it's an easy way in and it's an easy way out, which we'll talk about here in a second. But as it turns out, ACE2 receptors are not just found on the lining of our respiratory tract. They are found in other organs as well. And that's why we're seeing these different complications in people from brain to the liver to the heart and even the vasculature that runs through our bodies because these cells also have this ACE2 receptor. So the virus is ending up in places that even it technically doesn't want to be in. Okay. So that's how the coronavirus gets into the cell. So what about getting out? What's the deal with this? So last time I told you that there are these little bubbles that the cell uses to transport materials called vesicles. So these little bubbles called vesicles, and the cell is actually going to package the virus in these vesicles. And then it's going to use them to shoot, essentially, the virus out so they can infect other cells. I just said a minute ago that the virus likes to infect the epithelial lining of our respiratory tract, right? There's a really good reason for that. It's because viruses are actually kind of smart in a way. They know that that epithelial lining is saturated with these mucosal cells. And what mucosal cells do is they produce what we call different expectorants. So mucosal cells can make saliva, they can make mucus. Essentially what that is the virus is being put into this saliva, this mucus, and then it's expectorated when we talk, when we breathe, when we laugh, when we cry, when we sneeze, you name it. Anytime our mouths are open, we are essentially releasing these tiny droplets of saliva. And if we are infected with this virus, those tiny droplets of saliva are actually carrying the virus out into the environment around us. So that's why we have these strict social distancing guidelines, because there's a certain distance that those little drops of saliva are known to travel. And the idea is if we can keep people far enough apart, their chances of being infected by a sick person become much, much lower. This is also why we've been asking people to stay in and not go out and party or hang out with friends or go to bars or go to restaurants, because the more distance we can keep, the longer we can prevent that transmission of the virus. The reason that's important is because if we were able to keep people isolated long enough, we could literally destroy this virus 100%. If you were to keep people isolated long enough for them to get sick and then heal, that virus would be obliterated. And that's actually something we've seen with other versions of coronavirus. So SARS-1, for instance, a few years ago, you don't hear much about it now because we were able to isolate and destroy that virus. There's another virus that's similar called MERS, and that was also from several years ago. And that virus you don't see either because we were able to isolate and destroy it. But COVID-19 is a little bit more complicated because of what we're about to talk about. And that is the fact that you can be contagious and not know you're sick for a very unpredictable amount of time. So generally with like the cold and flu, we know that you can get infected and then a few days later you start to show symptoms, and then like a week later or 2 weeks later, you are better and we know you're not contagious anymore. So, you start to feel lousy, you stay home from school, you stay home from work, you get better, and then you go back and you're not contagious. It's a lot more complicated with COVID-19 because we don't really know as much about it as we do those viruses, and our bodies don't all respond to it the same way. Some people are going to not show symptoms at all, which means that they are going to be contagious the entirety of the time that they're infected with the virus. So they'll be out doing stuff with other people, infecting other people who are then going to get sick and not even know it. So that brings us to this little graph here that I've made for you all. So you've probably been hearing a lot about this term called incubation period. And I've done some Googling, and there are a bunch of different definitions out there, which is really unhelpful. So I'm going to give you the virology definition of an infection, an incubation period, because this is a virus, and this is the definition that really matters. So let me just first describe this graph. So on the x-axis here, so from left to right, we have time. So we're going to be talking about what happens over the course of time. And again, this is going to get a little wishy-washy because everybody seems to be a little bit different. Here on the y-axis, we're going to have viral load. So how much virus are you actually producing? So I'm going to draw a line here to show how much you're producing and when. Here we have incubation period, and we have another term, latent period, and we have this contagious period. So I'm now going to go through each one of these to tell you exactly what they mean so you can know exactly what the scientific community is trying to convey when we're saying, you can be contagious and not know it. So first off, let's start with incubation period. The incubation period describes the amount of time it takes from when you are infected with that first virus particle until you start to show symptoms. So we'll say from initial infection until symptoms arise. So here, you actually catch the virus quite a ways before you start to show symptoms. And for coronavirus, this can vary greatly. In fact, this incubation period, the time that you actually catch the virus until you actually start to show symptoms, can be as short as 2 days in some people, or it can be as long as 14 days in others. So that's a pretty big difference in incubation period. And again, this all has to do with your own personal body chemistry, your own immune system, or maybe you're immunocompromised, maybe you're in really great shape. all of these things are a factor, which makes this very hard to pinpoint. But on average, the average person, it will take 5 days from the time that they actually communicate the virus, they catch it from somebody else, until they start to show symptoms. So the incubation period on this can vary. But that's not what's important. What's really important is this latent period. So a latent period is the time it takes from the virus to actually enter your body until you become contagious. So I showed you a second ago on that picture, one virus particle enters a cell and then it starts producing millions. So you're not going to be contagious right away. It's going to take a little bit of time. How long? We don't exactly know. This could be as short as, 2 days. It could be as long as 5 days. For some people, you may never know what that latency period is. But generally, the latency period is going to be, let's just say a couple days. Like on average, for this virus, you're probably going to have a couple days of a latency period where you are infected with the virus, but you're not contagious. As soon as that latency period is over, so, maybe it's a day, maybe it's 2 days, could be, a much longer depending on your own personal body chemistry and how much of the viral load you got in the first place. This is just an average. After that latent period, you enter what we call the contagious period. So the contagious period is you're actually producing enough virus to be able to expectorate it and infect other people. And as you can see, this happens within the incubation period. So if you have an incubation period of 14 days, you could be contagious for a very long time, as many as 12 days before you start to show symptoms. So the key here, though, the really, really important takeaway here is that this contagious period starts before you start to show symptoms. So much before you actually know you're sick. Because you see here, symptoms don't start until well into your contagious period. The interesting thing about COVID-19 is some people don't ever show symptoms. So they may be spreading the virus and never know. It makes this virus very hard to pinpoint. So there's this idea of contact tracing. This is what we've used in the past to be able to keep a virus manageable and under control in order to isolate it so that we can hopefully prevent it from spreading to other people so we can obliterate it. However, this idea that the incubation period can vary so much and some people may never show symptoms makes contact tracing very difficult to do because there may be people out there actively spreading the virus that will never show symptoms and we will never ever know about it. So that's why we've started putting these other security measures in place, like masks, for instance. We'll talk about that in the next video. Masks are a really great way to ensure that you're not spreading the virus to other people, even if you don't know you're sick. Okay, so now let's look at the viral load. I'm just going to draw you a quick little line to show you what amount of virus you're producing at what time so you can kind of see another illustration of this. So here, right at the beginning is when you contract the virus. And you're going to start to kind of build this slowly. And then it's going to build up and up and up and up. And then as you start to show symptoms, this is when this line is going to start to fall until you reach the end of the contagious period. So that's because when you start to show symptoms is generally when your body starts to fight the infection. So when you start to feel sick and you get a fever or you start to get real phlegmy, what that is, that's your body's natural way of combating a virus. It's trying to help out your immune system to kind of either cook the virus out or to be able to encapsulate it in mucus so that it can't spread as much as it would if it were just left, unfettered. So this latent period, you're still producing the virus. You hit the contagious period before you show symptoms, and then you so you're contagious before you start to show symptoms, and when you show symptoms, I'm a little tongue-tied here, is when you start to actively fight the virus. And you can see here that even after you stop showing symptoms, you're still a little bit contagious. You're still spreading enough of the virus to be able to infect other people. So again, this is just to give you a basic understanding of why the scientific community is pushing this idea of social distancing and wearing masks and trying to separate yourselves from other people as much as possible. Because it's a lot about keeping yourself safe so that you don't get sick, but it's also a lot about keeping other people safe. Because working together is the only way that we can beat this virus. If we aren't all working on the same front, then there's really no way that we'll ever get this under control. And we're going to have to keep doing all of this nonsense for a lot longer than we would otherwise have to if we can just band together, go through these very simple instructions that are being presented by the scientific community so that we can open back up and get back to life as normal as possible, as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's all for this video. Thank you again for your attention. I really appreciate your support. Once again, if you have any questions about this or anything else with the virus, please feel free to reach out to me on social media or via my YouTube page. And until next time, stay well, stay safe, and stay healthy.